Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Callan Cohen, the Director of Birding Africa. He founded this tour company about 24 years ago and has led over 200 tours across Africa and Madagascar. He's also the co-author of the Southern African Bird Finder book and is a member of the team who last year set the birding big day record of 335 species in 24 hours. So we had a last minute cancellation in our conservation conversation schedule, and Callan kindly allowed us to replay a talk that he gave at the Virtual African Bird Fair earlier this year. But Callan is online, so I'd like to invite Callan to turn on your video and unmute your microphone if you're there, and you can just say hello to everyone before I play the video.
Thanks for the intro, Christina. Can you hear me all right? Am I online?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, I mean, it's a pre-recorded talk. But I'm going to be here in the background, and then when the talk's done, I'll be available to answer some questions live. So yeah, please send some questions in the chat and we can do it after the talk. Thanks very much.
Great. I will chat to you after the video. And so please, everyone, enjoy Callan's talk. And let me just turn up the volume.
After birds. Thanks for the Virtual African Bird Fair team for inviting me, especially Andrew, to share some thoughts with you. And certainly something I've thought about quite a bit. I've been leading bird watching tours through Birding Africa for the last 24 years, traveling all around Africa, from South Africa to East Africa, to Ethiopia, across to West Africa. And it's something that I do think about quite a lot, like what are Africa's most sought after birds? What birds do people want to see? And what birds capture my own imagination? And I've realized it's actually quite a hard question to answer. We've got about 2,800 species of birds in Africa. A lot of really spectacular birds, a lot of birds that are only found in Africa that people do want to see. And so, in fact, many of Africa's birds are sought after. And how does one come up with a list to go through in more detail? It was certainly much harder than I thought. And I think being spectacular certainly helps. But I think also being rare and difficult to find also helps. Birds that are most sought after tend to be birds that aren't necessarily very easy to see, that people might try to see multiple times and not see. Have to go to very particular places, employ very particular strategies. And so I'm just going to share my thoughts on what I think some of the more interesting ones are with you. Certainly, one of the birds that captured my imagination, and I know has captured lots of other people's imaginations across Africa, is the African Pitta. It used to be called the Angolan Pitta. And in many ways, Pittas have captured people's imagination all around the world. I mean, we know about Chris Goody's book, The Jewel Hunter, all about trying to see all the world's Pittas in a year. Pittas are really special. They're very secretive birds. They've got amazing colors. But they're also very, very difficult to see. They're very, very secretive, and they tend to need to be, things have to be just right in order to see them. African Pitta is no exception. It's an extremely beautiful bird with red and electric blue. And despite these colors, can remain mostly unseen as it sort of shuffles around in the leaf litter in dense thickets. It becomes really difficult to see. Here's a beautiful picture of one taken on a Zambia tour a year or two ago by Jan Ruzika. And I just want to acknowledge all the photographers actually in this talk. I mean, I've taken many of the pics myself, but many of the really good ones actually have been taken by others. I've taken them all from Birding Africa tour reports. And I want to thank all the photographers for letting us use their pics. Really appreciate it. They should all be acknowledged. The ones that aren't acknowledged are my own pics. And certainly when I started birding or started getting more into birding, African Pitta was seen as a bit of a holy grail of birds to find, really difficult birds in Southern Africa especially. It was best known then from the Zambezi Valley up in the far north of the sub-region. You had to get your timing just right. And if I put up a little map below, some of you will recognize that this is a map from eBird. eBird's a really great citizen science program, and it's a really good resource to check when you're researching African birds. And this is a map showing all the African Pitta records. And you can see, once you orient there, that there's a lot of records, in fact, almost all across Africa. And you can see that there's some in far West Africa. Forget about those for now. But look, there's a bunch of records in East Africa, and then perhaps the records are most concentrated still in this area around the border of Zimbabwe and Zambia. And that is definitely the best area to go and find them. But finding African Pitta does require a bit of knowledge about the bird's habits. And in some ways, it's quite an interesting species because it tells us quite a bit about what's happening in Africa as a whole. And here's a rather ancient map of Africa, very, very old. Looks like it's taken from an old school textbook. And one or two of the country names are very out of date. And the reason I'm including it here is because it's in many ways one of the nicest maps that I've seen in terms of helping one understand how the habitats of Africa relate to the political boundaries. And that's quite important because when you see a political map of Africa and you're trying to decide which country you might want to go and visit and what birds you want to see in a particular area, you tend to think about the shapes of the countries. And it's really useful when you're trying to understand Africa's birds to think less about the shape of the countries and more about the shape of the big habitat zones in Africa. So just looking right into the middle of Africa, you can see the big green patch. That's, of course, these are the Congo Basin forests. Africa's equivalent to the Amazon forests, going right through the equatorial region. And you can also see in many ways that Africa is a little bit like a mirror image if you had to sort of fold it on the equator. So what I mean by that is you have the forests in the middle. Then on either side of the forest, you have these paler greens that are the moist woodlands. In southern Africa, we call them Brachystegia or Myamba woodlands. And you then have the drier woodlands, which then grade to deserts on either side. So these are the sort of more arid woodlands in the south and the more arid woodlands in the north, and they go into deserts. You can also see that Africa's deserts are separated. So there's a sort of Sahara region, which is separate from the sort of Horn of Africa, and which is separate from the Karoo-Namib Desert as well. Another really important thing to bear in mind with Africa is that highlands play a tremendous role in terms of bird speciation. And if you look here, the East African rift system, which actually runs from East Africa all the way down to Southern Africa, has these purple bits, and those are all mountainous regions. And those, of course, have different habitats and different bird specials. So it helps to have a good idea of Africa's broad habitats, because you might hear when you're reading about some of these species about which countries they occur in, but in many ways it's which habitats they occur in too. Another interesting thing to look at is in West Africa. If you look below the Sahara, there's this area where the woodlands meet the desert, and you get this sort of intermediate region called the Sahel, which has got some very special birds in it, and we'll talk about a little bit later. And you can see how the habitat zone stretches all the way across Africa. So you have this habitat that starts in Senegal, goes through Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan, all the way to Ethiopia. And then the next habitat, which becomes a bit drier, extending across the same countries, but a little bit to the north. That is in West Africa. When you're thinking about a bird that might occur in this particular habitat zone, you need to think about different places to try and find it in the different countries that the habitat encompasses. So African Pitta is an intra-Africa migrant. And that is a really important part of its strategy, of its life strategy, and how one should think about trying to see it. Because what it does is that the weather in Africa in many ways can be explained quite simply. And that is, the equator goes to the middle of Africa. So Africa has the northern part of Africa, the northern hemisphere, the southern part of Africa, and the southern hemisphere. And what happens is, as the seasons move, the air heats up as the sun heats the land, it draws in moist air and brings rain with it. And so the rain in Africa basically follows the hottest times of year and the sun. There are some exceptions in the Mediterranean region, in the far south near Cape Town and the far north. in the Mediterranean basin. But very broadly speaking, that's what happens in Africa. So in the southern hemisphere summer, before the rains come, it's extremely dry. It hasn't rained for about 6 months. And when the rains come, the thunderstorms arrive. And as it starts to get hot, the rains come, the thunderstorms arrive. There's a tremendous profusion of life. All the insects hatch, frogs come out into the puddles, and there's a huge pulse of life. And many birds migrate to Southern Africa at this time specifically to try and breed and to eat all this extra food, this sort of immense productivity. And African Pitta is one of those birds. It arrives and starts to display as the first rains arrive in Southern Africa. And it breeds and spends the season in, feeding and exploiting this temporary explosion of life. And then once the summer progresses and things start to calm down a little bit, then the African pittas sort of move again out of Southern Africa once things start to dry. And they move, I'm going to go back a slide, because they move, if you look again at the map, how they breed in this area down here during the rains, and then they move up into the forest zone during the time when it's dry further south. And again, when the rains come the next year, they move back south again. So it's a very typical intra-African migration pattern. African pittas living in the forest zone in the non-breeding season, and then breeding in these very dry, arid thickets along the Zambezi Valley, best seen in southern Zambia, northern Zimbabwe, along similar habitats in Mozambique, and extending all the way across into Angola as well, and some other habitats. Top tips for finding African Pitta: be in the habitats that are described around the Zambezi Valley and that general region at the start of the rains, generally the first week of December. There is a bit of variation each year, so it can be quite hard to get right. But generally the first week of December is a good time. That's when they jump on branches doing their remarkable display flight where they expose their electric blue plumage. They make that strange frog-like call that once you've heard it will stay in your memory forever. And if you get there a little bit early and the rains haven't come, or the rains are a little bit late, then the best way to try and find them is to listen very carefully, because they're actually quite noisy feeders. And when they shuffle around in the leaves looking for things underneath the leaves, you can often hear them from quite a distance away. So if you just sit really still and listen and then slowly creep up, it's going to increase your chances of seeing them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the forest zone now. So again, to remind you, look how the main forest zone extends from Uganda across Central Africa to West Africa. Here's a picture of the forest zone. And I mentioned to you that African Pitta, when it's not breeding, sort of retreats to the forest, because the forests have quite a lot of productivity. It rains a little bit in the forest throughout the year. There's always going to be some food there. It's not quite like the Zambezi Valley, which is extremely dry and harsh in winter, but then when the rains come, it's extremely productive. Well, there is actually another species of Pitta in Africa that's focused on the forest zone, and as far as we know, never leaves it. It's the green-breasted Pitta. It's become very well known in recent years. It has a different strategy to African Pitta, and it actually breeds in the dry season. Even though in the forests, it rains a little bit throughout the year, so there's not really a long dry season, it still prefers to breed in the months where the rain is less intense. Well, I guess probably because it's a little bit warmer for catching insects, and the nest, would not get damaged as much by the storms. And so green-breasted Pitta is a bird. I've got the map there at the bottom. You can see there's actually relatively few places it's been recorded. It's, widely recorded across Central Africa, sort of from Uganda westwards. But actually the number of places where people see them reliably is very, very, very low. In fact, until reasonably recently, green-breasted Pitta was an extremely, extremely difficult bird to see. Nobody had any particular spots where they were reliable. The call wasn't known, and encounters with it were extreme, just based on extreme chance. And And it's only, been in the last, 10 years or so that green-breasted pittas have become really possible to see. And this is thanks to the really skilled guides at Uganda's Kibale National Park, which discovered they have a breeding population of green-breasted pittas there. They got to know the birds' routines and habits and places, and have become very successful in terms of being able to show people green-breasted pittas and share them with them. These pics of green-breasted pittas, Mayor's pic there was taken on one of our tours that we led there a few years ago. This other pic by Heinrich Human, kindly shared his pics with us, was also taken literally less than a month ago in Uganda, in Kibale Forest. These pictures in some ways make this bird look relatively easy to see, and the local guides have got to know them really well now, and so sometimes you go there and they are easy to see. Other times they're not. I mean, green-breasted pitta can be an extremely difficult bird to see. It can be very, very, very secretive if it doesn't want to be seen. One of the ways to find them is to go in the breeding season, so to go in June, and it seems they also display to some extent in January as well, and to first try and hear them calling, and then to try and track them down. So unlike African pitta, which breeds in a sort of quite dense thickets, but it is a sort of low woodland and quite bright and sunny, green-breasted pitta lives in the central African rainforests. It's extremely tall trees, up to 30 meters high, extremely dense understory, and has a similar electric blue parts in its plumage. And so what it does is it also likes to display early in the morning, and it also has a similar frog-like call, very spectacular to African pitta, but perhaps a bit louder and a little bit different actually, and almost seems a little bit more booming. And what they do is very, very early in the morning, what you need to do to have your best chance of seeing them is to go really early while it's still dark. And then you walk through the forest in the dark with your guide. And it's quite a special time. You hear all the other birds waking up, the great blue turacos calling from the treetops. Often there'll be chimpanzees shrieking in the distance. And you go and you wait there. And then as the sunlight comes down, the sun rises and the sunlight comes down into the forest, the green-breasted pittas actually go often quite high in the trees to where the sunlight's coming, and they do this wonderful display where they, jump up on the branches, making this very bizarre call, and at the same time sort of exposing their red and electric blue. It's really a fantastic experience if you can have it, and it's definitely a bird worth trying to see. And Uganda is the place to see it. Uganda is also pretty special because it has different types of forest. So the Rift Valley cuts down through Uganda, and on the western side of the Rift Valley, it forms a mountain range known as the Albertine Rift, and the forests pictured here are much mistier and higher, and they have quite a different bird life to the sort of lower lying forests. One of the particular, there's some wonderful Albertine Rift endemics. Another sought after bird in Africa, which I haven't included because I don't know of any photographs, is yellow-crested helmet shrike, which is a bird found across the border in the Congo. Is very, very little known. But there's another very, very special bird that one gets up in the highland forests of Uganda. And here it is. It's the African green broadbill. Many people are more familiar with the African broadbill, which is brown and streaky and has a very distinctive little display flight. This is the African green broadbill, sometimes called the Grau's broadbill, unfortunately. And it's really a wonderful and very, very interesting little bird. If you want to see it, you also need to go up to Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in the highlands of southwestern Uganda. It does occur in the area, it seems, throughout the year, but the breeding seasons are best, especially June, July, and in the other dry season in January also. And can be a very difficult bird to find. The call's extremely soft, but the local guides know them really well, often find the nests. But the area where you get them is in some forest on the edge of a big swamp called Mbwindi Swamp. And it's quite an extreme and rather difficult hike to get down there. Often when it's raining, it can be very slippery. If the forest or if the elephants are there, it can also be extremely difficult with having to move off the trail with the elephants. So it can be quite an exciting hike. But if you go down there and you manage to see this bird, it's an extremely wonderful little bird to see. It's rather small and has very soft, high-pitched calls. And I'm showing you two things here. The one is the map. You can see how extremely limited it is just in the Albertine Rift area of Central Africa, these highland misty forests where it occurs. And I'm also showing a picture of a yellow-bellied sunbird ascity from Madagascar, which you're probably all wondering is a bit inappropriate at this stage. But this is also just to draw the link that the green broadbills are actually related, in fact, to the ascites of Madagascar. It's a very interesting little link that's fascinating. In some ways, ascites and green broadbills are rather closely related. So it's just a very interesting systematic link. Of course, Uganda is famous for another one of Africa's most sought after birds. Here's a picture taking a dugout canoe into a papyrus swamp. I'm sure you all know this one. It's one of Africa's most famous sought after birds, the Shoebill. Another wonderful pic from Heinrich from just the last month. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful birds. I've had the privilege and good luck to go on many tours looking for them, and every time you see a Shoebill, it really is a wonderful experience. You can get reasonably close to the birds in the dugout canoes. They're quite patient hunters. They stand there. They're very steely. They're very still. They look sort of dinosaur-like. I guess all birds do to some extent, but there's just something about them, the way they're sort of patient and very still behavior. And they hunt large fish such as lungfish. They sort of do this massive big collapse down onto the fish when they eventually catch them. But most of the time they just spend standing extremely still, waiting for fish to come close to them. But the bill is remarkable, and it is a truly unique bird, and it's definitely one worth trying to see. Here's a picture of its distribution map. You can see in the bottom there, you can see Uganda is definitely the best place to try and see them. They also do occur up in the sort of this temporary Sud wetlands of South Sudan. It's a bit more difficult logistically. And they also go all the way down to Zambia, where one can also see them in the Bangweru swamps. There's a small population there, and many people have seen them there. At the moment, the Uganda seems to be the most logistically easy place to try and see them. Well, owls are often pretty special birds for people, and Africa has some really special sought after owls. Many of them, there's a few that are really poorly known. Things like maned owl, Shelley's eagle owl, very poorly known birds, and no doubt extremely sought after. We just don't know enough about where they occur and how to find them. I wonder how many of you, I'm guessing probably many of you know the feather that I'm holding here in this picture, the sort of ginger feather found in riverside, big trees along riverside areas in many parts of Africa. It's of course from the Pell's fishing owl, and I thought it might be quite fun to focus on just one group of owls, the fishing owls. There's a picture by Martin Grimm of a Pell's owl. It's a really wonderful bird. It's captured the imagination of many birders and is definitely on, I would say, a very large percentage of birders' most sought after lists. I think one of the reasons for that is that, first, it's very beautiful. Those colors and the markings are extremely beautiful. Those big black eyes. It's a very large owl as well. But also, it's just hard to find. I mean, you can go to an area that's extremely good for them, and they're just not there when you go. And many people have been frustrated and again picked up the feather only to have to go second or third or fourth or fifth bird trip to finally see a Pell's owl. If you look at the map, you can see that they are quite widely distributed across Africa. There's some pretty good areas in southern Africa for trying to find them, along the Limpopo Valley, in Pafuri in the Northern Kruger National Park, around Mkuzi in KwaZulu-Natal. But again, being very typical Pearl's fishing owls, these sites will be good for a while, and then the birds will disappear. They'll just move a little bit to a different set of roost trees, maybe not very far away, but becoming inaccessible, and then frustrating people who are looking for them. Probably the most reliable area to find them is if you look a little bit towards the Okavango Delta here. There we go. Is the Okavango in Botswana. They are found in the Okavango Delta proper. Many camps are well known for them. The Okavango Delta is a wonderful place. It's got wonderful birds and wildlife. It's also extremely expensive. Most of the camps there are very exclusive, and it's also nice that you don't have to go to a very expensive Okavango camp in order to find Pearl's fishing owl, because the Okavango River actually flows through part of Namibia on its way, between Angola and Botswana, and there's some much better value camps along that area and along that what's called the Okavango Panhandle, in places such as around Shikawi, where one can stay in rather nice camps that are not deep in the delta, but still have probably the most reliable spots for Pearl's fishing owl. And that's definitely, if Pearl's is high on your list, I definitely recommend doing a trip to Shikawi, often best combined with Namibia. And then you do either a Namibian trip that includes it or an extension that heads to the Caprivi Strip, so you can go to Shikawi and find this bird. But Pearl's isn't the only fishing owl in Africa. We often, because it's so famous and so widespread, we sort of, and the others are so seldom seen, we often think that it is. But there are two other fishing owls in Africa. They're both actually much, much harder to see than Pearl's. The one on the right is vermiculated fishing owl, that pick by Rascoladi. That pick was also taken about a month ago. If you look at its distribution, you can see it's mostly found around Gabon in Central Africa. But there's also a few dots there in Zambia, and it's actually reasonably recently been discovered in northwestern Zambia and the Mwinilunga area. And that's certainly an area that's got lots of other special birds. If you ever get a chance to go up to Mwinilunga in northwestern Zambia, it's definitely worth trying to get that opportunity and to find out about going to try for see vermiculated fishing owl there. But probably the place where most people would see it is in Gabon. There's a number of places in Gabon. Those are the most reliable places you can get out onto the rivers at night and stand a fairly good chance of seeing them. On the left is picked by Birding Africa tour leader Tertius Khoos from our recent trip to Liberia and Sierra Leone, well, recent before COVID. And you can see, looking at the map, it's found very much in the Upper Guinea forests, so the forests to the west of Togo. A lot of birds' distribution ranges get split by the small gap in the forests around the countries have been in Togo. Rufous fishing owl is a bit of a smaller species of owl, of fishing owl. All of these are fishing owls. They live on big rivers and hunt fish, and looks a little bit like Pearl's, but more streaky, much smaller, with a bit of a different look to it, much more localized. Places to look for that, seen in relatively few places. Probably the best area is in Sierra Leone, in a place called Tiwai Island. That is the best area to go and look for that. The best way to find it is to go out at night in boats. You go out on the river with spotlights and just check all the waterside trees. It can take quite a lot of looking to find them. They're not necessarily very easy to find. We spent two or even 3 nights looking before we found this particular bird in the sort of palm forest overhanging the river at that point. But yeah, really special birds. Fishing owls are really special. So just refreshing back to the map of Africa and the sort of major habitats. I wanted to have a bit of change of habitat now and talk about the birds of a much drier area, the Sahel area. This is the area that lies between the Sahara and the woodlands of West Africa. It's sort of like a very arid woodland grassy area. It's extremely dry and has sort of desert adapted birds that occur in it. This is the first one I want to tell you a little bit about. It's an extremely camouflaged bird. It normally takes people a few moments to sort of figure out what's going on in this picture. This is a photo by Ron on one of the Cameroon tours some years ago. It's the Golden Nightjar. You see the eye there, the black eye. And there's the bill, the bird sitting down. There's the edge of it, there's the top of its head. Here's the ground where it sits, there's its tail. It's one of the most superbly camouflaged birds occurring in these very dry areas south of the Sahara. With these beautiful sort of speckled bits, mottled, vermiculated little bits on the feather tips. And when it flashes, it's got black and white in the plumage, so it's extremely obvious when it flashes. But normally one will walk right past and not even know they're there. It's a very poorly known bird. It's a bird that's had a lot of interest in recent years because it's been found just inside the Western Palearctic zone. So, a whole extra group of people have got more interest in it. But it's also a bird that the call and song has only been relatively recently discovered. The call was thought to be a churring call, but we only recently discovered, actually on one of our birding tours in 2010, that in fact they don't have a churring call at all. They have a call a bit like redneck nightjar, a very different and strange type of call. We made that discovery in northern Cameroon, and subsequently lots of birders have heard it making that call. And there's been a lot of interest in trying to find them and photograph them across the whole of the Sahel regions. Very special bird. This is another photo by Ron, and again, one of the Sahel birds. This is a quail plover. It's a bird not that many people have seen, actually. It again likes that very, very thin area and it's quite localized. It occurs actually in these very small grasslands, these very light grasslands in these areas with these sort of wispy grasses all the way, and even occurs all the way to Kenya, so it's seen there, but erratic in its occurrence there. I've only seen it once there in Savo. And you can get a sense of how camouflaged the bird is from this photo. It's just, relates to button quail, so it has a very slow button quail-like movement. You can see but it has the long legs. And this amazing sort of speckled plumage. The green leaf, in some ways, gives this bird away. It's probably, the golden nightjar is extremely well camouflaged, but I think quail plover to me is the most camouflaged bird that I've ever actually seen. We were walking in northern Cameroon some years ago, and the area there, unfortunately, is not safe to visit at the moment. But we flashed one of these birds out of this in this sort of dry, scrubby bushland. We had no idea it was there, and it sort of flew out and then landed a short while away. And we walked a little bit closer, and it just sort of stood there. And it did this funny sort of chameleon-like walk, the sort of slow, jerky walk that chameleons do, a little bit like a leaf blowing a little bit in the wind. So not still, but sort of moving a little bit jerkily as it sort of walks along. And we then realized that we were all busy watching it and photographing it and looking at where it went. And it was quite close to us. At that point, it didn't seem to want to fly. It was more interested in using its camouflage to its advantage. And so we were all watching it in sort of like a semicircle. It wasn't quite in our semicircle, but it was just a few meters away, and it was walking. And we were talking about how amazing camouflage it was and watching it and photographing it. And then at some point, somebody said, where is it actually? Where's it gone? And then we all realized, in fact, that it had actually walked out of our view from a few meters in front of us, and it was still only a few meters away, and we just couldn't see it. And it was open ground like this. It was just the camouflage was just really incredible, just a remarkable bird. Another special bird that occurs widely across the Sahel zone, from Mauritania all the way across, is the Nubian bustard. Nubian bustards generally are very sought after birds across the world, and Africa has a number of sought after bustards. The Nubians are a rather special one. Relatively few people have seen it. This photograph is from a trip we did in Chad a few years ago, where they are still reasonably common in one area. But there have been scattered sightings from Sudan all the way through Chad, all the way through Niger and through Mauritania. It's an increasingly rare bird, though. It's certainly threatened, but a bird that not too many people have seen. It's a medium-sized bustard, beautiful, pale grayish, almost bluish on the back of the neck, with orange around the collar and the very fine vermiculations in the back. And yeah, beautiful throat markings and crown markings. A very special bird. One could choose many other bustards to be on Africa's most sought after. Hoygeland's bustards, of the Horn of Africa, little brown bustard. Another bird that occurs in the Sahel region, so it occurs from the Gambia all the way across even to Ethiopia, is the Egyptian plover. It's this sort of famous crocodile bird that's rumored to pick from the teeth of crocodiles. It's quite common along big rivers, in these big rivers with sandy banks in these areas. Can be quite common and quite confiding. It's an iconic bird. It's very beautiful, extremely beautiful in flight, and now thought to be in its own family or subfamily, and an extremely elegant, beautiful and well-known bird that is definitely sought after in Africa. And its distribution extends all the way from the west coast all the way across to Ethiopia. So if I go there again, you can then see the map, and it occurs all the way from here all the way, and it even occurs in some of these Ethiopian in some of the rivers that come to the base of the Ethiopian highlands. So if you look here, you can see Ethiopia's got a lot of these purple high areas. Ethiopia is sort of the roof of Africa. It has this extremely high and big mountainous range with lots of special endemic species, and it's definitely worth a mention because it has a number of rather special sought after birds. Probably one of the ones with the most allure is the Prince Raspoli's turaco. The turacos are a family of birds that are only found in Africa. There's about 25 to 30 species, depending on your taxonomy. Many of them extremely beautiful, found in forests. It would be hard to choose the best ones. Ruwenzori turaco of the Albertine Rift is a wonderful. Red-crested turaco of Angola, should be on everybody's list. But Prince Raspoli's, with the very shaggy white crest and just general stunning coloration, is one that was lost to science for a while. It was collected by the Italian Prince Raspoli in I think it was the 1890s. And shortly after collecting it, he was killed by an elephant. The specimen of the turaco was recovered, but it wasn't known exactly where in Ethiopia it occurred. And it was only in around about the time of the Second World War that, in fact, the mystery was solved, and they were found to occur in an area of central Ethiopia and south central Ethiopia. And more research has been done now by BirdLife and various other Ethiopian partners, looking at the different types of forests these birds occur in. And now, from being a complete mystery, we know a tremendous amount about Prince Raspoli's turaco, and it is reasonably easy to go down to the area where they occur on a birding tour and get to see it. They're found in particular forests, so you need to plan particularly which forests you're going to get to. And it is quite far south in Ethiopia, so it's well more than a day's drive from the capital, but definitely an area worth going to. Another really special highland bird in Ethiopia is a spot-breasted lapwing. Many people have, a soft spot for waders and lapwings in particular. They've got really beautiful, striking colors, and this one is no exception. Really beautiful bird. Unfortunately, declining in numbers in the Ethiopian highlands, but definitely one worth trying to find. one does have to bear in mind when one's looking for them, even though they're reasonably widespread in the highlands, that time of year can be important. And it's also important to think about what the rain is doing, because when it's raining up in the highlands, they're split up into pairs and they breed in inundated areas, in small flooded wetlands on the edge of those, and can be found in a very wide area. But then in the dry season, when all these little temporary wetlands dry up and only the bigger lakes remain, they tend to congregate in larger numbers around relatively few lakes. And you need to be sure that if you visit Ethiopia or you go on a tour, that your guide knows where these lakes are, because otherwise it can be possible to do a trip in the highlands and miss them because you don't know the exact spots to go to in the dry season. And of course, another very famous bird that would have to be mentioned is the Ethiopian or Streseman's bush crow. It is actually in the crow family. It's a remarkable bird with a very interesting social lifestyle. Has been well studied at the moment, and it's just one of these really wonderful Ethiopian birds that one really should try and experience if you have the chance to. Ethiopia is one of the most remarkable birding countries in Africa, and definitely worth experiencing. I'm going to dip back to the forest now, though, from the highlands of Ethiopia, and take you back to the West and Central African forests. And there's a particular group of birds that I haven't yet mentioned that occur in these forests. In particular, most of the forests are not mountainous. They're in these vast lowland plains, but in places you get rocky hills and big granite outcrops that occur inside the forests. And that's the habitat that this family of two birds have chosen. And what one has to do is to go and visit these rocky areas and to see if you get a chance of the birds. They make the most remarkable nests, swallow-like, with mud. You can see here there's a nest stuck on the side of this granite boulder, and it looks just like a swallow's nest or a rock martin's nest, and you can see another nest up there. The way to find these birds is to wait extremely still in the evening, and they come to roost. Even if they're not breeding, they come to roost, to sleep the night in these nests. The nests are actually slightly angled. The rocks are angled, and so the birds don't get wet if it rains. It rains a lot in West and Central Africa, and so they've chosen these dry sites to roost. And here it is, the excitement of seeing Piccathartes or rockfowl when it comes just back to its roost. This is yellow-headed rockfowl. You also get another species called red-headed rockfowl. And here it is coming to roost on its nest. They're the most bizarre birds, quite large actually, with these funny bare heads, funny skin that's just remarkable colors, red and yellow, and very, that black patch on the back of the head, and these big crow-like bills and these long silvery gray legs. They're remarkable, really remarkable species. Very little is known about them. They've been studied at their nests, but when they go away from their nests, they're hardly ever seen in the forest. Nobody knows what their calls are like. It's remarkable that we know so little about them. The yellow-headed, and here's a picture by Tasso Leventis of the red-headed Piccathartes, are just these two remarkable birds that really just sort of exemplify the sort of mysteriousness of the West African forests, and are definitely birds worth trying to see. Relatively recently, yellow-headed, there's more attention on them now, and yellow-headed Piccathartes has become reasonably easy to see in Ghana. There's some wonderful community projects where there's an ecotourism setup where you can go and sit on benches in the evening and watch yellow-headed Piccathartes come to their roost, all supporting a really nice community project. And there's much more knowledge and information about them now. Red-headed Piccathartes is much harder to see. It's found in Cameroon, basically. Not so easy to see in Gabon anymore. Korup National Park and Campo National Park are places one can see it, but it's much harder to see red-headed Piccathartes than it is to see yellow-headed Piccathartes. Staying in the forest zone, I guess there's another bird which has certainly captured my imagination about what might be one of the most sought-after birds to see in Africa. And here's the pictures of some well-known African bird books. And on the cover is this rather enigmatic bird, the Congo peacock, or the Congo peafowl. You can see it's a large bird. It's closely related to other peafowl. It doesn't have as big a tail, but it can also still spread its tail. Has this sort of male has this sort of glossy royal blue plumage and these big red throat patch, and the female's green on the back, sort of chestnut colored. And they're just remarkably, it's an extremely interesting species. It's only found in the middle of the Congo Basin forests. So it's only found in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in an area where there are very, very few roads, vast areas of forest, which are reasonably inaccessible except by boat. And an area that has unfortunately been affected a lot by conflicts, and so access to the area was just extremely limited just because of the general logistics. And as recently as 1936, when most of Africa's birds and mammals had all been described to science, there were rumors of a strange peacock that occurred in the Congo Basin. And most of these rumors, in fact, were considered, made up stories, fake news, as it were. And it was only as late, really, as 1936 that the scientific community got to know about these birds. The local hunters, of course, knew them very well. It's extremely secretive and difficult to catch species. But there was an American ornithologist in a big expedition that eventually drew the connection between some local feathers that he'd seen in a headdress and some old specimens that had been collected years before. And he asked local hunters to go and procure some of these birds. And eventually the first full specimens of Congo peafowl were found. And there was, in fact, confirmed, in fact, that a peacock lives in Central African forests. And they still do live there. Remarkably, at that time, a few were captured live, and were even taken across to some zoos. And so the only real photographs of this bird are, in fact, in captivity. But the bird still exists in the Congo Basin forests. Very few people have, or very few scientists have ever seen it. Even hunters find it very hard to catch, or even to see it. It's an extremely secretive species. It's probably one of the most secretive birds in Africa. And it's just one that has captured many people's imagination. Many people have tried to find them and, haven't succeeded, simply because it's just so difficult to get to the area. And once you get there, the birds are extremely difficult to see, extremely secretive. I had the chance to go in 2005. So that's getting 16 years ago now, to go and try and find Congo peafowl. And the journey starts taking off on a small light airplane. There are no roads, so one can't drive in there. In Kinshasa, in the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, flying over the Congo River, really looks like a huge sea. I mean, the scale of the Congo is, must remind one a bit of the Amazon, this giant river. And then you just end up flying for hours and hours over forest, reasonably unbroken forest, patches of grassland in the middle. There we go. Some areas have got quite big grassy patches in them, and it was in one of these patches that the airplane that I was in was able to land on a small missionary airstrip. Quite exciting flying over there and thinking about what might be below, looking through all the treetops. And then, of course, arriving at this place, the study site that I was going to go to was a 30-kilometer walk. One had to wade chest deep through water a lot of the way. Remarkable area where the forest was flooded by the rivers breaking its banks. Some of the area had to be navigated by canoe, such as you can see here with this canoe with my tripod and bag in it. And really was the journey to try and find and look for this Congo peafowl was really a very special and very intense journey for me. And in fact, to tell the full story would probably take more time than I have now. And so what I really wanted to say is that I guess we all have sought after birds in Africa that we really want to see. And I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of my time and my life chasing these down and finding them and looking for them and trying to find them. And I hope that this talk has inspired you to maybe think a bit more about some of these birds, to have some of your own species. There's no need. Sought after birds for you might be sought after birds that particularly capture your imagination for some reason. They could be seeing your first Narina trogon, tracking one down in the forest nearby, seeing a pendant-winged nightjar at dusk over somewhere in Africa. This list of sought after species that I've gone through now is very much a personal and a very small selection of sought after species. There are far more birds that I could add to this list. The species of flufftails, crab plovers, all sorts of things, sangley linnets. The list is really endless. There's lots and lots to explore in Africa. And I urge you to look up all sorts of things you think you might want to see and try and make plans to find out more about them and to see if you can see them. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Callan, for allowing us to play that talk again. Callan has been experiencing some internet issues, so he's now on his phone. Hopefully we will be able to hang on to him for some questions. But thank you. That was a fascinating tour of some of the really beautiful and exciting birds on this continent of ours. So just quickly, before we get to some questions, if you do have a question for Callan, please pop it in the Q&A box. And then also, please participate in the post-webinar survey, which will pop up when you exit the webinar. It just takes about 2 minutes to fill in. And then next week, our last webinar for the year, Craig and Christine Widows will join us to share their stories about their big year and the search for 700 species in South Africa. So now on to a couple of questions. I see there's actually only one so far, but lots of messages coming through in the chat. So Callan, Eileen asks whether you ended up seeing the Congo Peafowl in the end, or is that a spoiler?
That would probably be a spoiler. Sorry about the internet issues. Sorry, everyone. The internet landline where I am has just died for the whole village where I am in Scarborough in Cape Town. So I'm standing outside using Zoom on my phone for the first time. So it seems to be working, but it's a bit hard to see questions and comments and things. Yeah, I'll have to, in terms of the Congo Peafowl, there's a story that I've written about it, and I'll happily share the story with you. It's in a book called Featherings. I'm not sure if you've seen that book, which is a collection of stories from various bird people around South Africa. And so if you're able to get hold of a copy of the book, then you can read about it in there. If you can't, I'll happily email you a copy of the book. You can track me down via BirdLife or on social media, and I can send you a message about that.
Well, there've actually been a couple of requests in the chat, and Eleanor Mary has posted a question in the box saying, can we have a presentation giving us the story of the peafowl? So maybe we must have you back next year on Conservation Conversations.
Yeah, it's a long and very involved story, but an interesting one.
I'm sure everyone would be keen to hear more. So we'll chat to you about that. And then Mark Jarvis asks, what is the most rewarding area to visit away from South Africa? So I guess it depends what you class as rewarding, but what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a completely, yeah, that's I guess it depends what your expectations are as to what you'll find rewarding, and what you're after and what you see. I mean, it's very similar to sort of like what is your favorite birding destination. It's a really tricky area to answer. I mean, Africa's got so many great areas. I mean, we really focused in South Africa and Southern Africa on the area in our field guide, but there's such amazing areas, further north, from the highlands of Ethiopia to the forests of West Africa. I mean, when people ask, I often say Uganda is a country that I really, really like. Lots of really cool birds packed into a small area. And so if I was forced to pick one, I might say Uganda, but it might choose depending on where I've been recently and, what perspectives I have.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it depends what you're after, but yeah, Uganda is somewhere that I would love to go. And then Matthew Shirley asks if there are any recordings that you know of a rufous fishing owl. He was in Guinea and Liberia and heard fishing owls and wants to rule the species out. So do you have any tips for Matthew?
Hey Matt, I don't actually know of any recordings. When I was in Liberia and Sierra Leone, we went out a lot at night and we tried to hear them and try to get recordings, but we didn't have any luck. But the fishing owls have got quite a varied set of calls. Vermiculated fishing owl, obviously not in necessarily that exact area, but has got quite a repertoire of calls. So rufous may also have a variety of calls. And then, of course, there's all these owls that you get in West and Central Africa that we don't know the calls from. So figuring out night sounds is often quite hard. But if you want to send any through to me, if you have any recordings, Matt, you should just, send them through.
And then, not many more questions in the chat box. And I think since your internet is dodgy and there's actually a little bit of feedback on your sound, but I think we'll leave it there. But just Eileen asks, what was the name of the book that you mentioned your peafowl story was in?
It's called Featherings, as in bird feathers, Featherings. And there's some fun stories in there from other people. It's a collection of short stories. But if anybody is struggling to find that and would like a copy, I'll happily send a PDF of the story that I wrote. I'm not quite sure how to do it because I can't send it now from my phone. But if any of you contact me via BirdLife or social media, then I'm happy to send you that one story that'll hopefully inspire you to go and get the book.
Yes, I'm sure it will. Otherwise, people can always email conversations@birdlife.org.za and we can put you in contact with Callan.
Yes, I'll happily share the story there.
Great. Well, then I think we will leave it there and save your mobile data. And we're just gone 8 o'clock and we normally like to finish around now anyway. So I would just like to say thanks, Callan, very much for making yourself available this evening and for your great talk. There are lots of great comments coming through on the chat box and I'll send those to you tomorrow. But if you have any last words for people, then we can sign off.
Well, thanks very much, Christina, for the opportunity to speak to you all again, and you and the rest of the team, and Andrew as well. And sorry everyone that I'm not able to directly read the comments and questions at this stage, but thanks everyone for tuning in, and for hosting this, Christina. It was really great. Thank you.
Great, you're welcome.
Sorry about the internet.
No, no worries. These things happen. So that just leaves me to thank all our viewers this evening. Thank you for joining us for another Conservation Conversations, and stay safe out there with the new variant coming around, and keep birding, and we'll see you next week for our last webinar for the year. Good night.